Well, a couple of years ago, I was invited to conduct a Sunday morning service at the Unitarian Universalist Church I had served in upstate New York prior to settling here in Madison. And while that particular congregation was approximately the same size as when I had left some 2 decades earlier, I was surprised to read in that Sunday's paper that the region's Roman Catholic bishop was about to shutter more than 24 churches in his diocese due to declining attendance at Mass. And that decision was causing considerable consternation among the faithful, many of whom retained a strong emotional connection to their home parishes. Nevertheless, the move to consolidate these Roman Catholic parishes was inevitable, because despite the recent influx of committed Catholics from Latin America, membership nationwide in the Catholic movement had declined more than a quarter since 1980. And the drop has probably been even more precipitous in the Northeast, where the influx of Hispanic Catholics has been less pronounced. Nor is the Roman Catholic faith alone in its troubles. According to the National Council of Churches, in just the last 8 years, the Presbyterian Church of the USA has experienced almost a 28% decline in its membership. The United Church of Christ, almost 26%. The Episcopal Church, 20%. The Evangelical Lutheran Church, 18% loss. The American Baptist Church, 13.5% members lost just during the last 8 years. Now, back in the 1970s and 80s, losses in mainline Protestant churches like these were usually attributed to the defection of members to the ranks of the conservative evangelicals. But that is no longer the case, for in recent years, the evangelical movement has also suffered attrition. Even the independent megachurches, often touted by national news magazines as the wave of the future, have suffered reverses. New megachurches spring up. They are successful for a time, Diana Butler Bass writes, until they are forced to close down and sell their buildings. Now, of course, the pattern of decline is not uniform. Church involvement has remained strong in the Deep South and in the Intermountain states of Utah and Idaho. And moreover, older Americans are more likely to remain religiously active than those under 40, and women more so than men. According to the comprehensive Faith Matters survey conducted in 2008 by Robert Putnam and his colleagues at Harvard, younger men are turning away from religion more rapidly than any other segment of the demographic. Generally speaking, today's youth are more skeptical about conventional religion than their counterparts were just a decade or two ago. Because in the mid-1980s, young adults identifying as evangelical Christians outnumbered those who professed no religion by a factor of 2 to 1. By 2008, those proportions had flipped, with nuns now outdistancing evangelicals by a significant margin. Now, despite these trends, it is probably premature to predict that religion will simply wither away. Nearly half of Americans still affirm that religion is important to them, almost half. By contrast, less than 1/10 of Swedes make that assertion, and only 12% of the Dutch. 3/4 of Americans still say that religion is a factor in their lives, and almost 90% of us claim to pray, at least on occasion. And as Harvey Cox points out, in the non-Western developing world, Christianity is growing faster than it ever has before. So with respect to religion, signs of vitality as well as infirmity can be pointed to. And it's also well to remember in any assessment of religion that in years past, others have anticipated an end to this phenomenon. Sigmund Freud wrote religion's obituary almost a century ago. And in the 1960s, death of God theologians like Thomas Altizer brashly declared, quote, that God has died in our time, in our history, and in our existence. In retrospect, neither of those observations proved valid. And yet, one is tempted to ask why, in our particular era, in the second decade of the 21st century, religion is ceasing to hold and attract the interest of growing numbers of Americans. Several factors seem to have come into play, and one important one seems to be fear. or rather, the lack thereof. Now, I cannot count the number of conversations I have had with fellow religious liberals on the topic of hell and damnation. And ordinarily, the subject would arise during a conversation about the relatively small size of our own UU movement. The reason we are not more popular, I would be told repeatedly so, is because we do not dangle the carrot and stick of hell and heaven in front of people's noses. But if that reasoning did make a certain amount of sense in the past, it is, I believe, of far less importance today, because fewer and fewer Americans believe in hell, and of the 60% who still do, most are convinced that they and those they care about are not going to end up there. When people who have rejected religious institutions and dogmas, the so-called apostates, when they are queried about the sources of their dissatisfaction, they give a variety of answers. And for many, it is that religion, the religion that they are familiar with, has ceased to make sense. And in saying this, they were not necessarily referring to irresolvable conflicts between science and religion or faith and reason. Rather, it had more to do with certain moral propositions that left a bad taste in their mouths, the doctrine of hell and damnation being one of the more prominent examples. For instance, a middle-aged man from upstate New York recently looked back on his childhood experience of conventional religion, saying, "My father engaged in a refined method of child abuse. He made many demands and rules, and if we broke those rules and did not admit to our wrongdoing and beg forgiveness, the consequences could be brutal. I lived in fear of him. But I am not speaking here of my earthly father, I am referring to my heavenly one. I was constantly afraid of doing something wrong, displeasing God, and I was filled with shame over the thought that his only begotten son had to suffer and die to compensate for my horridness. I felt unworthy of this Father's love." And the writer then goes on to draw a comparison between this intimidating sky father and the man who had actually sired him, who he describes as a kind, hardworking farmer who had a roaring laugh, never went to church, and loved to shock his kids by reciting off-color ditties. Now, more than 30 years would pass before this writer found the courage to question and then to repudiate the angry God of his childhood nightmares. This God, he concluded, is a bully. And if we all treated each other like this, the world would be full of bullies. So it was then the unsavory character of the biblical God that caused this gentleman to swear off of conventional religion. And according to surveys, many of America's younger adults appear to share these feelings. As the sociologist Philip Zuckerman writes in his book entitled Faith No More, I call this acquired incredulity syndrome. For many apostates, the problem becomes the perceived immorality of God and the Lord's apparent lack of righteousness. Now, of course, religion has not helped its own cause in this respect in recent years. There have been child abuse scandals and cover-ups of same, religiously motivated terrorist attacks, pitched battles over gay marriage and reproductive freedom, and way too much religious involvement in partisan politics. And as a result, surveys do indicate that many Americans have concluded that religion is hypocritical, hysterical, and judgmental. There's another important factor that is reflected in some advice that a homiletics professor once gave his seminary students. He said to them, "Above all else, you must not bore the people in the pews." In other words, worship services and church life in general must be engaging, it must be relevant, it must be fresh, it must always strive for excellence. And unfortunately, in too many cases, this is not what the people in the pews are getting. As Diana Butler Bass points out, many people are just bored. They are bored with church as usual, with church as club, with church as entertainment, with church as work. And so 40% of the American faithful report that they are only moderately satisfied or frankly dissatisfied with their present church. And that's bad news, because today there are simply too many alternatives available, like Ironman triathlons, for people to put up for long with programming that is predictable or mediocre. But again, these reasons for the rejection of religion do not apply across the board. Those who are the most dissatisfied tend to be younger adults, and especially the young adults who have gone to college, or who have lived abroad, or who have read widely. And indeed, education is perhaps the most salient factor in the decline of religious interest and religious involvement. Not only does college hone one's critical thinking skills, it produces a more questioning and skeptical orientation, and it also exposes students to new perspectives that may be completely at variance with those held by their church and their families of origin. As one becomes aware of other people's religious attitudes, Phil Zuckerman observes, we are forced to contemplate the question, if they can believe that, why the heck do I believe this? Education matters. And so does financial well-being. 74% of poor Americans say that it is very important, critically important, to have faith in God. Only 50% of those with greater wealth make the same claim. Now, historically, religion, and especially the Abrahamic religions, has always served as a source of consolation for the poor and the oppressed. But as a society becomes more prosperous, as people begin to feel more secure about and happy with their earthly existence, well, religion becomes less relevant. And not just in the West, but in the Far East, where Buddhism predominates, greater prosperity has been leading to a sharp decline in religious observance. People would rather go shopping, a Thai Buddhist leader recently complained, and today they only come to the temple for weddings and for funerals. So there's no question then that religion, as it has been traditionally perceived and practiced, is becoming less attractive to growing numbers of people, especially to those who are younger, better educated, and who earn a decent income. But then that raises an interesting question. Is religion, per se, declining? Or is it just one species, one manifestation of religion that has lost much of its persuasiveness and its authority? Well, evidence does suggest that much of the recent disenchantment has to do with certain elements, certain aspects of religion that no longer seem to be credible. Now, if, as Daniel Dennett defines it, if religion is a system whose participants avow belief in supernatural agents whose approval they seek, and furthermore, if religion requires a god or gods who are effective agents in real time and who make certain demands upon us, well, if that is the concept of religion we're talking about, that is the very one that more and more people seem to be having trouble with. And likewise, when Robert Putnam sought to measure the degree and the depth of Americans' religiosity, 2 of the 6 criteria that he selected were belief in God and attendance at religious services. But must one believe in God and observe the Sabbath in a congregational setting to be considered religious? If so, many Americans no longer qualify. Clearly, many thoughtful people have dispensed with religion because they no longer find its revelatory claims about God and angels and miracles and virgin mothers and original sin and heaven and hell and papal infallibility and transubstantiation and all the rest of the rigmarole, they no longer find it convincing. And they are not interested in any religion that requires from them a suspension of disbelief or a compromise of their moral values. And yet, one can still be religious on one's own terms. As a friend of Harvey Cox's put it to him, I am a practicing Christian. I am not always a believing one. And indeed, this is the crux of the problem for many who have fallen away from religion. The problem is belief. That is to say, that in order to be religious, we must be believers. We must be orthodox. We must believe the right things. We must believe the eternal truths vetted and vouchsafed by some sectarian authority. But what if the religious enterprise is not primarily about believing? A good question, and one that Jesus of Nazareth would probably answer in the negative. Jesus didn't compose a creed. He didn't require his followers to recite a profession of faith. What he cared about, and it's clear from the Gospels, is people's behavior, how we treat one another. As the theologian Dwight Friesen sees it, Jesus had no interest in establishing a new orthodoxy. Rather, his preaching and his healing were calculated to guide people onto a path that promised them a full and flourishing life. To set forth and envision a path that promises people a full and flourishing life. Many scholars have noted that the Christian creedal statements did not even exist until the 4th century of the Common Era. And up until that time, belief was strictly secondary to behavior. And a Christian was someone who actively practiced the love of God and the love of neighbor. And in the early church, a failure to offer hospitality or to support the good works of the congregation, that was considered to be a much more serious offense than holding some peculiar view about Jesus or the fate of the human soul. Carl Jung says that human beings have a built-in religious need, which suggests that as long as there are human beings, there will be religion. But if that's the case, what exactly is the religion we're talking about? What purpose does it ultimately serve? According to Parker Palmer, religion is a system or a process for discovering meaning and purpose amidst the world's chaos and when faced with the specter of our own mortality. And in a similar vein, the psychologist William Sheldon speaks of a craving for knowledge of the right direction, the right path, for a life path that will lead to serenity, and not just knowledge, but genuine peace of mind. And that, he suggests, is a religious agenda. And then in the latest edition of the UU World, our denomination's president, Peter Morales, calls belief the enemy of real religion. Because real religion has much more to do with what we love than with what we think. It's about the life-affirming values and the living beings that we willingly give our hearts to. So back to the initial question, does religion have a future? I would say that it does, but the future will look quite different from the past. The so-called age of belief is rapidly passing away, and its refugees are fearlessly exploring new ideas, dabbling with new spiritual practices, revisiting the ways and the mores of the ancients, and weaving their own religious tapestries out of the strands of various faith traditions. Now, because of its negative connotations, many people have eschewed the term religious in favor of the term spiritual. I am spiritual, but I am not religious. Because religion, these people feel, is too closely connected with oppressive rules, haughty hierarchies, and irrelevant rituals. But again, real religion doesn't require any of this. These are merely artifacts, whereas the essence of religion is much more subtle and much more subjective. Religion, whatever form it takes, is about what saves us. It is about what helps us to acquire a sense of existential safety. And it could be the unhealthy rush of our lives, the prison of our possessions, debilitating doubts about our own worthiness. It may be any of these things that we need to be saved from, as Barbara Brown Taylor alluded. To be religious, then, is to seek and to find salvation, whether or not you know God's name, and whether or not you have ever knelt at the altar rail to receive communion. So religion, as a cultural phenomenon, is not dying, nor is it disappearing as a basic human need. It would be more accurate to think of it in evolutionary terms. The old garment of faith is taken off, or it falls to shreds, and underneath it something new emerges out of that worn cloth. Now, as Unitarian Universalists, we have always been comfortable with evolution and with change. We have always been open to new means and methods of adopting or addressing our members' spiritual aspirations and sensibilities. And as a non-creedal tradition, we have never placed a premium on belief, and we have always prized the individual freedom of conscience. And thus, Peter Morales, our president of our denomination, says that this faith of ours is well positioned to welcome and to serve those for whom the old-time religion no longer suffices. Seekers looking for an open, accepting environment where they can truly question and explore. We have an historic opportunity to help create a multi-faith future, Morales writes. Yes, ours is not a large movement, but it is a promising one, which is why at a time when so many of the mainline denominations are in decline, we, my friends, are still growing. If the future for some religions is less than bright, for us the time is right to make a real difference. May we be partners in that endeavor. Blessed be, and amen.